Well, there have been several times in my life when I've realized that something has happened, that whatever comes afterwards is going to be different from what came before. And the most clear cut of those occasions was in January of 2000 when I was living in New York City. And it was the moment when I found out about Dave the Potter, David Drake, the slave potter. And I opened the New York Times in January of 2000, and there was a large article all the way across the top of the paper about this slave potter from South Carolina who had made these wonderful pots in the early and middle parts of the 19th century in Edgefield, South Carolina. And I read it with such interest because I was from South Carolina, and I had never heard of this man before. He's an astonishing man, and he wrote poems on his pots. And at that time, as I read in the article, it was against the law to teach slaves to read or write. So he was risking a great deal by writing these poems. And at the end of the article, they said little is known about his life, but we know who his owners were, and those owners were my ancestors. And it just, everything, the ground tilted for me because I realized that my ancestors had been slaveholders, which I didn't know, suspected, but had never wanted to face it directly. And I found out that they were pottery manufacturers, which I had no idea about. And I found out about this man who, while he was owned by them, made these wonderful works of art. And I thought, how on earth did this happen? What is this all about? And I set out to find the answers to that, and I wrote a book about it. And it led me on this long journey of looking into the past, into my family, into the history of slavery, into the history of South Carolina. And it was a big deal for me coming to terms with all of that baggage from my family's past. And I found good things, and I found some really horrifying things. So it was a big deal for me to come to terms with all of that, and I'm still working on it. The article was about an exhibit, the first exhibit ever held that was completely devoted to Dave's work. And it had originated at the McKissick Museum and was traveling through the Eastern Coast museums. And it was going to be at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware. So I drove there, and I remember, as I recall, it was the first time I ever actually saw a Dave pot was in the rotunda of this wonderful old museum on the DuPont estate, Winterthur. And in this glass case on top of a pedestal was this wonderful pot by Dave with his name, D-A-V-E, written on it. And I walked up to it, and I could feel all the connection between my great-great-grandfather, Lewis Miles, who was one of his principal owners, and Dave and myself, and I felt this magnetic pull toward that piece of sculpture, really. And I walked up to it and I said, "Hello, Dave." And it felt like he was a person and I was a person, and I was going to find out about him and he was going to find out about me. And over the next 6 years, I studied his life and tried to understand the relationship and the interchange, the exchange between his owners, Lewis Miles, my great-great-grandfather, and himself. And Dave wrote about, on his pots, he wrote about Lewis Miles and other of his owners. And he wrote in pretty glowing terms, and I wondered, what on earth is that about a slave complimenting his owner? Is that to curry favor with him? Or was that the nature of their relationship? In one case, he's joking with his owner. He says, LM, Lewis Miles, LM says this handle will crack. In other words, the handle that he's writing about was on a jug, and Lewis Miles had come into the pottery and said, Dave, that's not going to work. You got to change that handle. And he left the handle in place and instead wrote for us, a century later, that his owner had said it was cracked. Now you make up your mind. And of course it hadn't cracked. It was in perfect shape. So he felt at ease enough to joke with his owner and put it in writing. But what am I to make of all that? I don't know. So that's what I mean, that I'm still struggling with all of this and trying to understand it. And I'll never get the full picture. None of us will. But thank goodness Dave left his words on his pots. It's one of the only instances of a slave writing about his life while he was still in bondage, while he could still be punished for it. Slaves who had escaped or after they were freed wrote about their lives, but Dave wrote about his life on the plantation while he was in danger, really. And that's what's so fascinating about it. Did Dave know that we would be reading what he had written 150 years later? I have no idea. It feels to me that he was making his bid to be remembered in this way. And we all want that. We all want to be remembered. And he found a way. I don't know if he consciously did that, but that's what happened. I mean, Dave is a very famous man now. My ancestors, no one knows about them except in relation to Dave. And that's the irony of the whole thing. They were the masters, he was the slave, but they're forgotten, and he is remembered today. And it's because of what he did. Did he set out to do it? I don't know, but his words are what we remember in his pots.